Welcome back once again. My name is Cody, aka C.E. Zulin, and I am here today to read Chapter 2 of Saints of the Paradise Valley. Remember, Angel of the Paradise Valley coming out mid-November 2020. Chapter 2, Waiting for Peaches. The cold water was crisp and refreshing as my anger underneath it began to boil. My long hair dripped in large sops, and my eyes opened like I had just entered the world for the first time. Avery, what the hell? Avery snickered madly between his short breaths. His shaggy blonde curls bounced with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. A wooden bucket hung in his hands, still dripping with the same purified well water that now soaked my face. The cave in the darkness wasn't the only nightmare I woke up from every morning. I thought you might be thirsty. What in the name of God is wrong with you? I'm soaked. Next time, perhaps we shouldn't try sleeping in through Sunday Mass. His laughter diminished as I struggled to wring dry my sopping mess of hair. His smile lingered while his eyes scanned furtively from my hair to my dripping wet pajamas before he quickly turned his head in shame. You overslept again. Mother told me to come get you since you missed it last week too. Yeah, well, she's not my mother. Besides, who cares if I sleep in? It's not like we ever have anywhere important to be. We live in a cave. To this, his smirk curled upward into a devious grin. Today we do. I stared at him incredulously, voice lowered. What do you mean? It's Peach Day, he whispered. And you won't get any if you don't hurry to the sermon. Now get dressed. My bitter fit of anger quickly disappeared. We didn't get peaches often. Hell, we didn't get anything often. But after the war, all of the peach trees burned to extinction. What remained were small quantities of reserves dug out of the old world ruins and purified by the Watchers. It was a delicacy, and my mouth salivated just thinking about their tart sweetness. Help me clean this up and we'll go. Only if you swear on my Red Sox jersey I get half of your peaches. Over my sopping dead body, I retorted. I leapt up to chase him out of the entranceway, where he narrowly got by. He hid behind a rusty support beam for cover while we stared at each other on opposite sides of the post, daring each other out, smiling wide. We bantered playfully, breathing heavy before he poked his head between the bars to taunt me. Look at this way, Starseed. You probably needed the shower. I can still see the drool caked on the side of your chin from here. Get out, I bellowed. My arms flung through the bars after him. His head slipped back and he began to run as my fist made a light connection with his shoulder. I watched him peel through the doorway, clutching his injury, giggling in pain as his voice echoed through the hallway. See you when there's nothing left. His voice trailed off, but an inflection of aching hung on the tail of his sentence. I smiled at his ridiculousness with confidence that I won the exchange. Uncertainly, I wiped my chin with the back of my hand and felt the dry residue of saliva peel off. I hated him sometimes. Avery McIntosh was a suburban legend of a kid. His mother, Olivia McIntosh, my unofficial adoptive mother, was head of the kitchen and one of the first inhabitants to colonize Shelter. She sat as a critical advisor on the community council. As a result, Avery and I got away with a lot more than we should have, searching for trouble wherever we could find it. Avery was the first friend I made since arriving in Shelter 10 years ago. Adulthood was kind to him in regards to appearance. Working with the carpenters in the East Wing made him strong. His biceps swelled out of his short-sleeved shirts, and he stood tall at a towering 6 feet. Even the tiny tuft of blonde curls I became so acquainted with as a child evolved into a rebellious mane of golden locks that puffed over his ears like wings. But the most striking quality about Avery had always been his eyes, which shone in two contrasting colors. His left was deep, a solid shade of dark brown and hazel, safe and consistent and resolute in its dependability. The same as his mother's. His right eye, however, glowed a brilliant shade of cyan, opaque and humming with vitality. Differing layers encircled the pupil, making it complex and erratic. The contrast between the two made me shiver, and I realized I would often allow myself to overlook the practical jokes and immaturity, if only just for an excuse to stare into them. Sifting through the airborne dust, I hung the blankets up to dry and cleaned myself off before getting dressed. If I had been asked 10 years ago to describe my ideal life for when I was older, Shelter would not have been my first answer. An underground tunnel system carved out of rocks and sand, it gave the illusion that we were merely pet mice in an obstacle course designed by God. cave of my room wrapped upward like a birdcage. Old, unused pipelines and plastic tiles stretched around until they sank back down to the other side. The only exit was the main doorway, which remained loosely covered with a raggedy blanket for a door. Every family of shelter was blessed with a custom salvation room of their own, which kept them safe, warm, and under close scrutiny. I appreciated my alone time, but sometimes longed for the comfort a family would give. As I picked my clothes off the floor, I imagined being scorned by my father for leaving my room in such shambles, or nagged by my mother for going out in public dressed like a boy. They were only voices in my head, however, and I elected to ignore them. I knew that nobody else here was brave enough to ever challenge me on it. After all, I was just poor Starseed, the orphan girl from Thunder Bay with no name who was left to die in a fire. I couldn't be expected to worry about such trivial things as taking care of myself. Before speeding out the door, I moved to my nightstand and picked up a silver locket. Inside was the last remaining picture of my family. I stared at it longingly, my brother, Sebastian, and I in its center, looking dumbly up at my mother and father. Time had weathered its edges, leaving the faces of my parents worn and faded. I didn't remember much about my life before the fire, just that it was the last time I ever really knew myself to be happy. I drew it around my neck carefully. Time may have taken them away from me, but I would always have their memory, however distant. Despairingly, I took one final look at the puddle sitting idly in the middle of the room. I imagined my father's voice beckoning me to stay. Unfortunately, some things were more important than cleaning. Closing the door behind me, I charged toward the East Wing Assembly Hall. The hallways were dimmed like a morning sunrise. At least that's what the Guardians told us. The lighting grid was designed to remind us of the world we once knew. The real lights had long since died, out above ground like everything else. The residential wings were vacant. The whole community was expected to be at the Sunday sermon. It was part of what the Watchers said kept us civilized and productive. To me, religion was just another tool that seemed to be thrown at us in a haphazard attempt to keep us in check. It wasn't that I didn't have faith in a presence outside of our own, it was just that I couldn't believe an all-powerful entity could let the world fall into such shambles, and I especially couldn't understand how I seemed to be the only one who thought so. There was once a time where I would have fought for such a belief. Now, I found it easier to fade into the background and keep my mouth shut. I bolted past each corner until the sounds of a choir could be heard and I lessened my stride. Subtly, I opened the stone-cast doors with a loud creak. At once, every head turned to me. Grace, the loud, frazzled, red-headed girl leading the choir, let out a loud yelp at the disturbance before silence filled the room. I walked to my seat with a low head in an attempt to ignore the looks of accusation. When I finally found my seat, I looked up to Father O'Shaughnessy, who offered me a weak smile of condolence before turning to the choir once more and counting them back in with a nod. Their voices filled the hall like a siren of angels. Of all the things maintained from the old world, I was happy that music was one of them. I listened distantly as their words sounded in my head like white noise in the background to my thoughts. And the angels cried for him, for Satan's prize was earned from sin. But God will lift us up again, in life, in death, and in heaven. I sunk in my seat as the entire hall sat back down. Mr. Baxter sat beside me, wrinkling his face as he did so. I couldn't understand why it was so important for me to attend the sermons. Every week it was the same thing. Father O'Shaughnessy made recitations as if the words in his hand had the power to change our despairing outlook on life. I tried to pay attention, but to me his sermons were just words on a page, twisted and reinterpreted to fit the week's lesson. Instead, I drifted off to the crowd of citizens hanging tightly to the Father's every word, blissfully content. In it, I caught a glimpse of my friends, Francisco and Jensen. Francisco turned to me with a wink before smiling and facing the front once again. I blushed and tried to act normal. That concludes today's sermon, announced the Father. I would like to thank you all for joining me here once again, but before you go, I have some announcements from the Guardians. Would Carl Ernest and Patricia Cummings please stand? Two teenagers stood from different points of the crowd awkwardly. The boy still had acne and the girl looked barely older than I was. Both of them seemed to be suffering from a lack of sleep, but they waved feebly to the audience. Carl and Patricia have just been accepted into the new Watcher Union. They have been blessed with the great honor of protecting our rights and defending our home from the dangers of the wasteland above. It's a dangerous job which the two of them have proudly accepted. We owe them each our lives. "We thank you for giving us your life," announced the crowd robotically. Everyone gave a big congratulatory applause for Carl and Patricia. A dozen or so hands could be heard clapping from the crowd, most excited of which belonged to Grace, who looked like she had never been more proud of anything in her life. Everyone else appeared more compassionate. Carl and Patty's final day in shelter will be Thursday, when they will leave for their first taste of field training. Be sure to say goodbye to them before they go off on this great venture. May you all go in peace, and God bless. The entire room scurried to their feet in a hurried attempt to be the first to leave. Carl and Patricia stood at the door with Father O'Shaughnessy, shaking people's hands and trying to appear polite. Mr. Baxter let us out without saying a word. When we got to the door, he firmly shook each person's hand with a simple "thank you" before heading off. I hurried after him, leaving the scared-looking kids with an awkward smile. "Another late morning?" he asked when I finally caught up. Jonathan Baxter was, after Avery, my greatest ally in shelter. A veteran of war, his face was weathered and scarred with the weight of a former life. His skin sagged weary on his forehead while crow's feet tugged tight against the pink scratches carved into his cheeks. Behind them rested a set of sea-green eyes which lit up whenever he smiled. A distinctive number 5 was tattooed crudely onto his neck, some mark of solidarity between him and his troop. When asked about it, he always gave the same reluctant answer. Some things in this world are better left unknown until you're prepared enough to understand them fully. I hated that. Though he had been through a lot and seen most of the world, he and I shared a lot of opinions about society and how things could be improved. And even though I was young, I liked that he never made me feel like my opinions were invalid or uneducated. For that reason, I made a habit of eating at least one meal a day with him to better educate myself on matters of the mind. Yes, I confessed guiltily. Shelter is a home of few rules, Starseed. Though we may not agree, you know I mustn't remind you of the importance of attending every service every week. Hearing an old guy drone on about some stories that happened millions of years ago in a land we're never going to see again? Yeah, I know. Some of us old guys still have some wisdom left in us, you know. I'm sorry, I quickly backstepped. You know I didn't mean... Mr. Baxter smiled only a smile he could muster. I know that. But did Father O'Shaughnessy know that? I hung my head apologetically. I'll apologize to Father O'Shaughnessy the next time I see him. I'm certain that would be appreciated. I felt bad for interrupting the sermon. In my mind, it would have been easier to just miss it entirely. If service wasn't mandatory, this all could have been avoided, but I bit my tongue in order to keep Mr. Baxter happy. In my defense, I wouldn't have been late if a certain curly-haired blonde boy didn't wake me up with a bucket of water to the face, I muttered. Avery? He responded with a definitive tone of disappointment. I simply nodded my head. Together we continued our walk forward. The East Wing was designed for labor. I watched as the sick patients from the hospital tunnels wandered outside. A bald woman with bloodshot eyes who clutched tightly to her IV stand stared me down. I quickly looked away and sped my stride. Oh boy, he said with a sigh. Come here, Starseed. Let me share a little secret with you about boys like Avery. Call me old-fashioned, but back in my day, boys only really picked on girls when they had a little crush. I scoffed at the idea and blew a raspberry so loud every Salvation room in the hallway would believe my disinterest. On me? Avery? No. Never. Not in a million years. I loved my talks with Mr. Baxter. In school, we would be shunned for asking too many questions and being difficult. But I felt safe asking questions about the world to Mr. Baxter. We shared ideas about the roles of government and religion, questionable topics which would earn me a one-on-one session with Shelter's unseen leaders if overheard by the wrong people. And he was always respectful in lending me insight and wisdom on indeterminate topics. But if he thought for 1 second that I had feelings for Avery, he was mistaken. You'll learn one day, my dear, that love does work in mysterious ways. Sometimes opposites attract, and more often than not, the unlikeliest of pairs can be triumphant in this game. You just have to be willing to observe the power it really holds over people. Crazier things have been done for less. I don't believe in love, I said. What's the point? All it ever leads to is pain. Mr. Baxter released a sigh and shook his head. It wasn't his usual lighthearted disappointment. This movement was instilled with a hint of frustration. It was unlike him to be so aggressive in one of our friendly talks. One day, Star, you'll learn that everything has its motivations. He tightened his grip over his words and spoke in a clear, disapproving tone. But you're still young, and a girl like yourself has no reason to be so cynical as to not believe in love. It's a powerful force not to be underestimated. Lives have been taken, families have broken, and empires have fallen, all in its name. Some of these things you've seen firsthand, if I recall correctly. Have you ever heard the story of the fisherman and the whale? Yes, I groaned. You've told me that one 1,000,000 times. The fisherman was told that if he was patient and kept casting his line, that one day he would catch a fish so big it would feed him forever. Every day he went back to the same fishing hole and didn't even get a nibble. What about it? And what do you think it means? I don't know. Perseverance, never giving up hope, mind over matter, all of the above. You need to have faith that something, somewhere greater than yourself will one day make up for your losses. I know you've had your setbacks, Starcy, but all you need to do is believe it'll come when it comes, and there's no way you can force it. But how can you keep fishing if you aren't even left with a trail of breadcrumbs to believe in? I would stop and think maybe I had the wrong lake. That's an interesting perspective, and maybe you do. Everyone on this planet has their own path. But you do recall how that story ends, correct? Yeah, I know he eventually catches the whale, but it's an impractical resolution. His fishing rod should have broken by the weight of it. Plus, the meat would go bad before he could eat it all, and then he'd be back to square one. Plus, who eats whale meat anyways? Why not just find a more consistent lifestyle and get a real job and buy his fish like every normal person out there? Mr. Baxter smiled at my persistence and rubbed his hand through my hair. Perhaps this old man needs new stories. Star, you can find your path whichever way you choose. Whether you're the one holding the rod or a shark in the ocean, I know you'll figure it out just fine. Certainly, love is not a gift that all of God's creatures get to enjoy in their lifetime, but one day, when you reach my age, you'll realize that everyone has to be willing to jump for something. Otherwise, life's not worth living. It's what makes us who we are. I scratched my head. Maybe this was another one of those stories I would understand when I was older. But Avery? In love? I gagged on the very idea of it. Mr. Baxter cackled at my misfortune. You may have lost your parents, Star, but you've adopted a new family, and that includes Avery whether you like it or not. We followed the line of paint along the walls until we reached the doors of the dining hall, an atrium of entrances with a rounded serving area on the back wall and a high roof that stretched far beyond the light's reach. In the spider web of mazes that comprised shelter, the dining area was at the heart of it all. The 4 wings of shelter, north, south, east, and west, all connected to the room in some way. People sprawled frantically through, rushing to get in line for breakfast, while a group of elderly watchers struggled to maintain order. I surveyed their circular room for a glimpse of my friends, but saw nothing but blank faces waiting patiently in the lineup. In the middle of them, a large gathering of small children rallied, pointing and laughing at some unknown wonderment while their parents ignored them. Everybody falls in love at some point, Star, concluded Mr. Baxter. Just remember, the second you stop feeling is the second you stop being human. Never trust a man. Everybody falls in love at some point, Star, concluded Mr. Baxter. Just remember, the second you stop feeling is the second you stop being human. Never trust a man who says he's never been in love. Even I've been smitten once or twice in my life, believe it or not. I almost shuddered at the idea of Mr. Baxter intimate with a woman. As long as I'd known him, he had always been some lone hero who conquered the world. To think of him opening himself up to heartbreak made my head spin. Still, if the dream of finding love kept him going at night, then more power to him. Although if he thought that Avery's feelings for me resembled love, he was sadly mistaken. Never in 1,000 years would I ever find myself falling for someone like Avery, my dear boy. We were just talking about you. Avery almost knocked me over from shock when he held me from behind the shoulders. Hi, Mr. Baxter. Good things, I hope. He let go as he shoved his face inches from mine. Star, my mom is going to let us cut the line. I told her you were sick with a fever. She took one look at your damp hair at the service and believed me. You coming? I looked from the enormous food line up to Mr. Baxter. One of the children at the center of the atrium called his dad out of the line. The rest of the family seemed unimpressed. I asked Mr. Baxter with my eyes if I may be excused from our conversation. Go on, kids. Peaches will wait for an old man like myself. But first, Avery, a quick word of advice. Avery's face suddenly sunk with fear as he turned to face Mr. Baxter. Mr. McIntosh, I was just informed now that you played a little practical joke on this young lady here this morning involving a bucket of water and a rude awakening. I want you to know that I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. First and foremost, water is a valuable resource that we cannot be discarding with the simple intention of embarrassing or insulting your colleagues. There's enough pain in this world without friends turning on each other. The discarding of precious resources at the cost of one of Shelter's own is not only wasteful, but outright rude, which leads me to my second point. He put his hand on my shoulders as if he was lecturing me as much as he was Avery. Women are the leaders of our race. They have overcome enough pains and tribulations in the creation of our society to warrant exclusion from any additional turmoil and should be treated as such, with class and respect from now on. Do we have an understanding? But Mr. Baxter, it was only I said, do we have an understanding? His tone was firm and demanding. Slowly, Avery nodded his head with resentful embarrassment. Good. Now apologize to the lass. But Avery, he asserted. I smiled. I loved when Mr. Baxter brought out his military-esque attitude to defend me. I was lucky to have someone like him looking out for my best interests. Sorry I poured water on you, Star. And I thought chivalry was dead, I joked. God only knows there isn't enough time left in this world to be making enemies of friends. You kids will learn that soon enough. Now get going. Your mother must be waiting. We darted toward the cafeteria lineup as another swarm of people bumped past us, rushing to the atrium core. I'm convinced it really must be the end of times if Mr. Baxter can wring an apology out of you, I laughed. I'm guessing you left out the part about washing your feet in the drinking water last week because they were sore. I may have omitted certain irrelevant details from my story. That's okay, he smirked along. Next time it just won't be fresh water I wake you up with. We lined up at the immediate front behind a decrepit old man with a cane, and Olivia waved us in with a smile. The smell of peaches wafted up into my nose, sending goosebumps to my tongue. In this moment, I was oblivious to the world. Feeling better, Star? She asked politely from the other side of the expo line. Olivia was a tall, light-skinned model of a woman. Her curly hair, usually a light brown counterpart to Avery's, was tied back in a bun. She had a small, mousy face and the sweet, soft gaze only possessed by a caring mother. Much, I lied. Thank you so much for sending Avery to get me. That speech on the importance of devotion was riveting. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Wasn't it, though? Here, have some extra peaches, hun. They'll help you feel better. She scooped an average-sized portion onto Avery's plate while he stared distractedly over into the crowd forming at the core. Hey, Mom, interrupted Avery, pointing to the middle of the atrium. Do you know what's going on over there? Probably just Peter Thornley telling another political tale. That whole family can blow up a balloon to fly with all the hot air they spew. I'll call someone to break it up soon. I was so distracted by Mr. Baxter and breakfast that I hadn't noticed just how big the scene was becoming. It was unlike Shelter to be so disorganized and rowdy. I knew it couldn't just be the Thornleys acting up again. Something was going on, and I would be damned if I missed it just for some peaches. Dropping my tray on the counter, I rushed over to see what it was. Avery took my cue and charged behind me. Suddenly, the entirety of Shelter seemed interested in the disturbance and began charging past us. One swarm after another flew by, excitedly murmuring something about the ceiling. I watched as the two military-garbed watchers struggled to contain the situation, seemingly panicked about whatever had happened. Francisco, I called, spotting my friend in the mess. What's going on? Apparently, a vandal attacked the atrium during the sermon. Nobody's ever seen anything like it before. What does it say? I asked. Nobody knows, but apparently the watcher sent for priority cleanup to remove it. Maybe it's a dirty word? I'm going to go see for myself before it's gone. Wait! Francisco darted straight into the mess of people. Quickly, Avery and I chased after him into the surge of bodies, unsure of exactly what we were looking for. We squeezed forward in search of a clearing before losing sight of each other. All around me, inquisitive faces stared upward, struggling with the knowledge that their beloved home was no longer as safe as they once imagined. To me, this was exciting. For once, something was happening in Shelter, and we were witnessing it firsthand. Star, over here, called Avery from a corner. I rushed over before the void could be filled and cranked my head upward, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The rounded cage of the atrium had a stone ceiling which rose high into blackness. Stock fluorescent lights dangled from it, seemingly hanging out of thin air, but nothing seemed affected by the vandals. What are we looking at exactly? I asked. Before I could receive an answer, something caught my eye from the dark wall just beyond the light fixture. A splash of green neon radiated dimly from the stone high up into the ceiling. At first I thought that radioactive material from the wastelands had penetrated our safe haven. When I examined the splatter more intricately, a message could be seen, crudely spray-painted onto the stone. I shoved my way toward it to better make out what it said, squinting my eyes. Hope is permanent and beautiful forever. The words read vaguely in a hauntingly toxic yellow residue. I could hear the stir from the crowd murmuring excitedly about what it could mean. Some of the younger children suspected a devotional message sent straight from heaven, while I caught some of the older women giving me dirty looks as they whispered ignorantly about the work of rebellious teenagers. I knew the words had to have a rational explanation, but still, the thrill of them echoed through me. The Watchers would be here soon to calm us down and make us believe that nothing happened. They were going to pretend like the author was some lunatic or radical, and soon, shelter would be back to normal, but the words would echo in the backs of our minds for a long time. I smiled awkwardly despite all the hysteria around me. Perhaps the significance wasn't in the message itself, but in the very fact that somebody had the willpower and determination to write the message. I thought briefly about what Mr. Baxter had just said about enemies and friends, and realized for the first time that I might not have been alone. Whoever did this wanted a reaction, and they got it. But they weren't living in shelter. And that's chapter 2. Remember, follow Saints of the Paradise Valley on Facebook, Twitter, and Goodreads, and keep an eye out for Angels of the Paradise Valley coming out mid-November. You can always buy an electronic copy of the book as well through Amazon and Kobo. Take care and stay tuned.